81 years ago, on the 10th of July 1940, the Battle of Britain began. It was the start of a 3-month military campaign in which the Royal Air Force defeated the German Air Force Luftwaffe and prevented a full-scale invasion.
The whole sky was black with aircraft. Wherever you looked, there were aircraft, and the sound of the engines, it felt like somebody was shaking you.
Whilst most of the pilots were English, many of the RAF's aces were foreigners. For instance, the 303 Polish Squadron became the most successful fighter command unit in the Battle of Britain, shooting down 126 German planes in only 42 days.
They were the most experienced pilots in the RAF. They had shot about 18% of all the German aircraft that were shot during the Battle of Britain.
Apart from the Battle of Britain, Polish armed forces in the West contributed to many different campaigns, such as those in North Africa, Normandy and Italy.
Ten cały klasztor był w strasznym stanie. To były gruzy, to były dosłownie olbrzymie gruzy.
Polish soldiers were one of the largest national formations fighting against Germany, and more than 200,000 of them had fought under the British High Command.
Poland's contribution to the final victory in Europe should never be forgotten.
Polish contribution during the Second World War helped change the course of the history, but their sacrifices were not always appreciated. This is the untold story about the Polish armed forces in the West. On September 1st, 1939, Germany, along with Slovakia, invaded Poland, with 16 days later, Soviet Union troops doing the same thing from the east. By 6th of October 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union had divided and annexed the whole of Poland. Whilst victory against two such powerful enemies was impossible, Poland never surrendered. A large part of Polish armed forces, as well as Poland's government, were evacuated through Romania to France, where they continued to struggle against the German army.
The government and the armed forces, of course including the Polish the Air Force, left Poland first to Romania and through Hungary, and various complicated routes they made it to France. They contributed to the defense of France in the summer of 1940, but following the collapse of France, they all moved to Britain. That was the only free country in Europe that was left. The Polish very quickly nicknamed Britain the island of the last hope, Wyspa Ostatniej Nadziei.
In 1940, after the collapse of France, 160,000 Polish soldiers, including 8,000 airmen, arrived on English soil to be met by a feeling of skepticism about their flying ability amongst the British pilots. The criticism was caused by German propaganda which slandered the Polish airmen.
The German propaganda was portraying the Polish Air Force as inept, so people didn't think much about the Poles initially, but that changed. Following the successes of the Polish squadrons during the Battle of Britain, and everybody could watch how they were defending London, where single squadrons were attacking swarms, several hundred German bombers, and were taking many of them out of the sky. People could see that with their own eyes, so the perception of the Poles changed rapidly in August and September 1940.
The Polish airmen quickly gained a reputation for being skilled. 145 of them fought in the Battle of Britain in planes such as this one, the Hurricane. They were responsible for 18% of the total amount of German planes shot down during this battle.
They were extremely effective when they came to Britain in the 1940. They had already had a battle experience during the invasion of Poland in September 1939, when they shot many German planes, contrary to what the German propaganda was saying. The 303 Squadron shot 126 German aircraft. That was a very large number.
The Poles fought with a different attitude than probably anyone else, because of what their country had suffered at the hands of the Germans since September in 1939. They really hated the enemy. They made some of the best fighter pilots we've ever seen in this country.
During the Second World War, there were 15 Polish squadrons based in Britain. Today, only few airmen who served in those are still alive, but due to coronavirus pandemic and their advanced age, I wasn't able to speak to them. However, I talked to Andrzej Michalski, whose uncle Leon was a navigator in the 307 Polish Night Squadron. I asked him what it's like to be a nephew of an actual hero.
I'm so proud that my great-uncle was one of these brave Polish airmen who protect England and Great Britain and also fought for freedom during World War II.
And what did your uncle do during the war?
My great-uncle was a navigator. They normally flew on a Mosquito with his pilot, and the most successful mission was the attacking Luftwaffe German air base in Norway. On the way to the target, they managed to shoot down the Junkers W340, and later on they destroyed another German plane at the Stavanger.
And how are the Polish pilots remembered now?
I think Polish pilots are better remembered now than they used to be. A few years ago, 2 new movies about 303 Squadron was released. Also, I've seen few documentary on British television, and also there is a few Polish organizations which promote the role of the Polish armed forces during World War II.
The Polish contribution to the Allied forces' victory during the war was not limited to the Battle of Britain. Poles operated one of the largest intelligence networks in Europe. As well as this, 3 Polish mathematicians that were led by Marian Rajewski pioneered early decryption work that led to the Allies eventually cracking the Enigma code. Finally, Polish armed forces were involved in various campaigns such as D-Day, the Battle of Monte Cassino, and many more. Colonel Otton Hulacki was a soldier of the 2nd Corps of General Władysław Anders and the hero of the Battle of Monte Cassino. He told me about his experience.
To był horror. Jak ja wlazłem tam po tym proporcie, który tam wisiał, ten proporcie, który zawiesiał na samym Monte Cassino, trupy niemieckie były poskładane na kupach, bo jeszcze nie było wyczyszczone nic, prawda? Ja miałem możliwość, ja wtedy już w 4. pułku byłem w dostawie czołgów. Mieliśmy możliwość dojechania, dojścia tam bez żadnych trudności. Więc prawie, że w tym samym dniu czy następnym już byłem na górze.
This is the Marble Arch in London, where 75 years ago people of Britain celebrated the victory and the end of the Second World War. The former British Labour government has organized a parade in which they invited representatives of foreign armies except Polish armed forces in the West. Why were there no Polish troops in the London Victory Parade?
After the war, there was expectation in Britain that the Poles would return to Poland, which of course was not possible. Following the Yalta Agreement in February 1945, the Allies recognized the new communist government in Poland, and they stopped recognizing the official Polish government, which was in London. Following that, an invitation was extended to the communists in Warsaw to send a delegation of Polish armed forces to the Victory Parade, but Stalin told the Poles not to accept that. The Poles who were in Great Britain were not invited, except a small contingent of the Polish pilots, who were extremely popular at that time. But the pilots, in solidarity with the other branches of armed forces, they declined, they did not take part. It was a very hurting experience for the Poles.
My only regret is how we treated Poland at the end of the war. But that's they were excluded from the victory parade, which I know was political, but a lot of English people, my father included, thought that was disgraceful.
Although the Second World War ended in 1945, Poland spent the next 45 years under the occupation of Russian communism. As a result, the Polish government in exile remained in London until 1990, when Lech Wałęsa became the first democratically elected president of Poland. Today, the contribution of Polish armed forces in the West has been commemorated by every British government since 2005, after the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair sent a formal apology to Polish people in which he expressed regret that the Poles had not been invited to the victory parade.